The survey drone surfaced at 3:40 hours, carrying nothing but a boot. Case Howell stood on the deck of the Kishian Deep Research platform and looked boot for a long time. He recognized it. Waterproof composite, left foot, size 11. A strip of red surveyor's tape knotted around the ankle the way Dr. Maren Voss had always done it. Her personal system for knowing left from right. In the dark of a dive, a habit she'd picked up during her first survey of the Hadean Trench on Earth and never dropped. The boot was intact. The lace was still tied. The leg it had once belonged to was not attached. Nobody said anything for a while. The platform crew stood in a loose horseshoe behind him, and the only sound was the water moving against the pylons and the distant high whine of off the Loch 9 basin. The planet's 2 moons were both up, throwing flat white light across 400 kilometers of black water that the colonists had taken to calling the loch for no better reason than that it looked like one. A vast, still inland sea, nearly featureless on the surface, sitting on top of a geological fracture zone that nobody had fully mapped because the instruments, coming back wrong. Case picked the boot up. It was cold. He put it down again. Time of her last transmission, he said. 22:11, said Reyes, the dive coordinator. She was 200 meters down, inside the marker grid, nothing unusual on the acoustics, and the drone went in after her at 22:40. Standard protocol when a diver doesn't surface on schedule. Case did the math without wanting to. 29 minutes. In the loch, at depth, in the fracture zone, 29 minutes meant she was gone. He had known Maren Voss for 11 years. He had been her graduate student, then her research partner, then, for a brief strange year in the middle of it all, something else, though neither of them had ever named it. She had called him 3 weeks ago from this platform, her voice careful and flat the way it got when she was excited about something she didn't want to oversell. I need you out here, Case. I found something. He'd asked her what. I don't know yet. That's why I need you. He looked out at the loch. Its surface gave nothing back. The shuttle from Port Keshin took 6 hours. Case spent most of it in the equipment bay, going through Maren's last filed data packets, which were thorough and strange. She had been mapping an anomalous acoustic shadow, roughly 4 kilometers below the survey floor, a region where the fracture zone opened into what the imaging suggested was a lateral cave system of significant extent, running under the western basin for at least 30 kilometers. The shadow was irregular in a way that natural geology usually wasn't. Irregular the way a structure was irregular. The way something built was irregular. He'd flagged that in his notes, and then stared at the flag for a long time. The shuttle hit turbulence over the basin, and the lights flickered. The man sitting across from him, a UN Colonial Authority representative named Stahl, who had boarded at Port Keshin without explanation and had not explained himself since, looked up from his tablet and met Case's eyes with the particular expression of a person who has already decided what the situation is and resents having to be present for the part where everyone else catches up. You're the paleobiologist, Stahl said. Xenobiologist, and you're from the authority. Science coordination, yes. We want to facilitate a smooth transition of the expedition's leadership. I haven't agreed to take it over. Dr. Voss is missing and presumed dead. You're the most qualified person available on a 12-hour notice window. The survey contract has a biological assessment clause. If we don't have someone with your credentials sign the environmental continuance forms in the next 48 hours, the terraforming consortium loses its bond window, and the whole colonial development timeline slips 18 months. Stahl said all of this the way someone reads a weather report. So you'll take it over. Case thought about the boot, about the red tape around the ankle. What was she mapping, he said. Stahl looked back at his tablet. Geological survey. Standard fracture assessment. She wasn't a geologist. Dr. Voss wore several hats. She found something, Case said. She called me because she found something, and 3 weeks later she's dead. What was it? Stahl did not answer. He had the face of a man whose job required him to be comfortable with silence as a tool. Case had met a lot of men like that. They all had the same mouth, thin, held just slightly too still, like they'd learned early that the face was a liability. Case turned back to the window and watched the loch come up below them, dark and flat and enormous. Somewhere down there, in the fracture zone, In the lateral cave system that bent and recurved under 30 kilometers of cold black rock, Marin's data was telling him something. He just didn't know yet what it was afraid of. He met the team over dinner in the platform's main module. There were 7 of them. Reyes, the dive coordinator, who had been with Marin from the start, and whose eyes were still doing the thing that eyes did in the first few days after. A sonar technician named Priya, who had the exhausted competence of someone who has been running double shifts. 2 divers, Kovacs and Fenn, both ex-colonial Marine, both quiet in the specific way of people trained to treat unfamiliar environments as problems to be solved rather than experiences to be felt. A surface engineer called Torben, who had the widest hands Case had ever seen and who spoke in complete sentences about equipment and nothing else. And a woman named Sarah who was, apparently, a documentary producer embedded by the authority to capture the discovery moment when the expedition found the Loch 9 monster. Case had not known about the Loch 9 monster. There's been footage, Sarah explained, with the particular enthusiasm of someone who has found a story and intends to own it. Colonists in the western settlements. Something moving on the surface. Large, very large. The authority thinks it's a plesiosaur-type megafauna. The planet had analogs in its Triassic equivalent period, and the loch is old enough that isolated populations could have survived. It would be the first confirmed macrofauna discovery on a colonial world. It would be enormous, Case said. Commercially, scientifically, culturally, I meant the animal. She stopped. Yes, very large, and the authority wants footage. The documentary deal funds a significant portion of the survey costs. Governor Hald has been very supportive. Case looked at Reyes. Reyes looked at the table. Kovacs and Fenn were eating steadily, faces neutral. Torben was doing something with a bolt. Dr. Voss knew about the footage, Case said. The colonial sightings. Yes, Sarah said. But she wasn't looking for a plesiosaur. Sarah's enthusiasm developed a small fracture. What was she looking for? Case thought about the acoustic shadow, about the irregular geometry, about the way Marin's voice had been careful and flat and not quite herself. I don't know yet. That's why I'm here. The thing washed up on the eastern shore at dawn on the second day. Torben found it on his morning check of the surface buoys, and by the time Case got there, half the team was already standing in a line on the shingle looking at it. It was large, 12 meters, maybe 15, lying in the low surf with the casual enormity of something that had never needed to consider the weight of its own body. Its skin was blue-gray and faintly iridescent in the early light, and its neck was long the way a neck was long in old paintings of sea monsters, and its 4 flippers were splayed out in the sand with the stillness of a thing that hadn't been dead for at least 2 days. It was, by any reasonable measure, the Loch 9 monster. Sarah was already filming. Priya was taking readings. Stahl had appeared from somewhere and was on a comm to Port Kessian. The whole scene had the quality of a conclusion, of an ending arriving neatly, wrapping things up, saying, "Here is the thing you were looking for. It is dead. You may report it and go home." Case stood apart from all of it and looked at the carcass and felt wrong. He walked the length of it. He crouched at the head, where the jaws were opened slightly, and he looked at the teeth, long and curved and designed for catching things in open water. He looked at the skin, was consistent with a deep-water megafauna, consistent with long evolution in lightless conditions. He looked at the musculature, visible through a tear in the flank, and the musculature was dense and functional and correct in every dimension. He pressed his thumb against the hide just behind the jawline and felt it give, slightly, in a way that was not quite right for an animal that had been dead 2 days. He found the seam 20 minutes later. It ran under the left rear flipper, nearly invisible 2 meters long, the kind of seam left by a fabrication process that was trying very hard to look like it wasn't a fabrication process. He traced it with his finger without saying anything, and he thought about what it meant to leave a carcass on a shore. And he thought about the word bait, and then he stood up and walked back to the platform. Stahl caught up with him on the walkway. "Hell of a find," Stahl said. "It's not real," Case said. A pause. "It's 15 meters of, it's manufactured, there's a seam. The tissue has the wrong post-mortem consistency. Whatever made that animal also made the decision to put it where we'd find it." He stopped walking. Marin found the cave system. She found something in it. something that didn't want to be found. And when she got close enough, it killed her. And now something is sitting at the bottom of this lake, watching us stand around a decoy and take readings. He looked at Stahl. You knew. Not all of it, but enough. The authority knew this wasn't a biological survey. Stahl's thin mouth did its thing. He was quiet for a long time. There have been incidents, he said finally. 3 survey teams in the last 18 months, in the fracture zone, all within 5 kilometers of the acoustic shadow. Equipment failure, lost personnel, dive accidents. The authority's position is that the fracture zone presents unacceptable geological risk, and that the incidents are consistent with natural causes. The authority's position is wrong. The authority's position is the one that keeps the terraforming contract solvent and 40,000 colonists employed. Case looked at him. That thing out there killed Marin Voss. Stahl didn't say anything, which was its own kind of answer. Going down, Case said. They went down at 800 the next morning. Case, Kovacs, Fens, Priya on sonar from the surface. Reyes, running the dive board. Torben had spent the night modifying 3 sets of rebreather rigs to extend range to 6 hours, muttering about tolerances and O-rings and the specific indignities of equipment that had been designed by someone who had never needed to trust their life to it. The locks swallowed them without ceremony. Visibility was better than Case expected. The fracture zone's geology pushed cold, upwellings that kept the particulate layer near the surface, and at depth the water was dark but not obscured, the kind of dark you could navigate if you moved slowly and trusted your instruments. He kept Marin's dive map on the wrist display and followed her last logged route. It felt like following a path someone had cleared through a forest. The way her sonar pings had probed ahead, the methodical side sweeps, careful approach angles of a scientist who knew she was close to something and wanted to get it right. At 240 meters, they reached the fracture mouth. It was wide, 20 meters across, irregular. Rock around it worn smooth in a way that suggested passage rather than erosion. Kovacs's light swept it, and Case saw on the left-hand wall a long scrape in the stone that was too high and too deliberate-looking, and a color that was slightly wrong for fresh rock exposure. He stopped and looked at the scrape, and felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the water temperature. Something had been through here recently. Something large, and in a hurry, he looked at Kovacs. Kovacs looked at him. Fen had drifted right and was shining her light up the fracture wall. Her posture, the specific posture of an ex-Marine who has identified an ambush and is working out the geometry without moving her head. Case keyed his comm. Priya, you have us barely. Acoustic shadow is already degrading your signal. You're right at the edge of the marker grid. We're going in. A pause. Doctor, Howell, log it and keep the channel open as long as you can. He looked at the fracture mouth. He thought about Marin going through it alone, in the dark, with her red-taped boot and her careful competence and 11 years of curiosity that had never learned how to be afraid of something. Just because it was new, he went through. The cave system opened up on the other side in a way that made his throat tighten. Not the tight throat of fear exactly, more the tight throat of scale, of dimension suddenly exceeding what the brain had prepared for. The lateral cavern stretched away from the fracture mouth for what the sonar estimated as 200 meters before the signal lost coherence, and the ceiling vaulted upward at least 60 meters above the floor. In the whitewash of their lights, the walls showed a regular pattern of indentations and angles that might have been natural. If you didn't know what natural rock formation looked like, Case had studied rock formations on 8 planets across 20 years, and he knew. This was not natural. Jesus, Kovacs said quietly, which was the most he had said in any context since had met him. Fen was already photographing. Camera's light strobed in the darkness and lit the indentations in sharp relief. Rows of them, uniform, slightly recessed, extending up the walls in a pattern that was almost grid-like, but not quite. Offset in a way that suggested something other than human aesthetic sense. Something that organized space differently. Something that had built this, shaped it, or inhabited it for long enough that the inhabiting had become indistinguishable from construction. How old is this rock formation? Fen asked. The surrounding geology is Triassic equivalent, 400 million years, give or take. Case moved his light along the floor. It was not rock at all. It was smoother, harder, a slightly different color, a surface that had been laid rather than formed. But this isn't the surrounding geology. He found the first drone at the far end of the chamber, wedged into an alcove in the left wall, dormant. It was the size of a large dog, vaguely crustacean in silhouette, with sensor arrays where eyes might have been on something biological. Its surface was the same blue-gray iridescence as the decoy carcass on the shore. Case floated in front of it for a long moment, and the drone did nothing, and he thought, "It's watching us right now. Whatever built it is watching us through it, right now, and has been watching every dive team that came into this fracture zone, and watched Marin, and made a decision about Marin that it made with intention and without hesitation." He felt rage then. Clean and cold, which was the useful kind. "There are more," Fen said from deeper in the alcove passage. Lots more, there were. The passage opened into a secondary chamber where a row of 12 drones sat in alcoves, all dormant, all oriented outward, all with their sensor arrays pointed toward the passage entrance. It was a sentry arrangement. 12 sentries, positioned to observe anything that entered from the fracture mouth, capable of. One of them moved. It was a small movement, the shift of a sensor array rotating to track Case as he drifted past its field of view. Nothing else moved. The drone did not deploy, but the array tracked him with slow, deliberate precision. And when he stopped moving, it stopped too, and they were still, in the water, looking at each other, across 400 million years, and whatever gulf exists, between something that evolved and something that was made. "Priya," Case said, very quietly. "Static," he tried again, more static. The acoustic shadow had swallowed the last of the signal. They were on their own. He'd told Reyes before the dive, "If the comms drop and we're not back in 4 hours, you do not send more people down. You call Port Kessian, and you tell them exactly what I told you. And you use the words, non-terrestrial structure in the message, because those words trigger a specific protocol, and the right people will come." What he hadn't said, because he hadn't wanted to say it out loud, was, "And if we don't come back at all, then you know, and knowing is what matters." He'd thought about Marin when he said it. He thought about her again now. The third chamber was larger than the first two combined, and it was not dormant. They came through a low connecting passage, 10 meters of crawling through water, that Kovacs and Fens navigated with the focused physicality of people who had trained for confined space under bad conditions. And the passage opened into the third chamber in Cases. Light caught the far wall and he understood. The far wall was alive, not alive the way biology was alive, not breathing or moving in any conventional sense. Alive in the way that a control surface was alive, in the way that a signal array was alive. The wall was covered in a layer of bioluminescent material that shifted and pulsed in patterns that were not random, patterns that moved across the surface in what Case's pattern-trained brain insisted were sequences, recursions, a language of light being spoken by a system that had been speaking it. Down here in this cave, under 400 meters of cold water on a planet that humans had thought was empty, for longer than recorded human history, standing in front of it, his back to them, looking at the light patterns with his arms hanging at his sides, was a figure in a dive suit. Case's heart did something complicated. "Marin," he said, without meaning to. The figure turned. It was not Marin. It was wearing Marin's suit, something shaped like Marin's suit. But the proportions were slightly wrong. The shoulders too level. The joints not quite at the right angles. The helmet faceplate dark. It moved like someone navigating a motor system that didn't entirely agree with the brain running it. And Case watched it step toward them, with the numb clarity of a person whose threat assessment has already run ahead of his conscious thought. Kovacs had already put himself between Case and the figure. Fen had a shaped charge in her hand. She'd brought 3, standard procedure for any dive into geological instability, in case the team needed to open a passage that had collapsed. She held it with the ease of someone who knew what she was doing, and was waiting to see if she needed to do it. The figure stopped. Case looked at it. It looked back at him, or at least oriented toward him, in the way a thing without eyes might orient toward the source of a signal it had decided was interesting. And then it did something Case hadn't expected. It stepped aside, and it turned back toward the living wall, and it raised one arm and held it there, fingers extended, like someone pointing at a document and saying, "Read this." "What is it doing?" Fen said. "Showing us something," Case said. "That's not, I know what it is. I know what it's wearing. It's showing us something." He moved around Kovacs, slowly keeping his movements large and visible the way you kept movements large and visible around an unfamiliar animal, and he floated up to the wall beside the figure and looked. The patterns on the wall shifted as he approached, responded to him, rearranged into something that was either more complex or more deliberate. He couldn't tell which, and moved in the new configuration for what felt 30 seconds, but his watch told him was 3 minutes. He watched. He didn't understand it. He wasn't supposed to understand it. Not yet. Understanding this wall was going to take teams of people and years of work, and more instruments than they had in the entire Keshian survey. Budget. But he understood the gesture. He understood something that had been sitting here for 400 million years deciding to stop hiding. He understood the decoy carcass now too. Not bait or not only bait, a test. Obvious answer on the shore and see who accepts the obvious answer and who doesn't. Marin hadn't accepted it. Marin had gone looking for what was beneath the answer, and they had. He stopped that thought. Filed it somewhere he'd deal with later. He reached up, slowly, and touched the wall with one gloved hand. The patterns cascaded outward from his palm like ripples on a surface, ran to the edges of the wall, returned as something different. The figure beside him made a sound that the water distorted into something almost musical, and the sound moved through Case's chest and settled there. "Okay," he said softly. "Okay, I see you." They came back to the fracture mouth at the 4-hour mark. Exactly. And the dive platform's lights were blazing above them as they surfaced, and Reyes was already on the dive board tracking their transponders. And the first thing Case saw when he came up the ladder was Stahl standing on the deck with 2 men in Colonial Authority gray behind him. "Dr. Howell," Stahl said, "I need you to come with me. I need 15 minutes with my team. Now please." Case stripped his glove off and handed it to Reyes and looked at Kovacs and Fen. They looked back. Something had changed in the past 4 hours. The wordless communion of people who have been somewhere together that nobody else has been, who have seen a thing nobody else has seen, who understand without saying it that this changes the shape of what comes next. 15 minutes, Case said again, and walked past Stahl. He spent the 15 minutes in the equipment bay with Kovacs and Fen and Priya. Reyes had filled her in, talking quickly and without drama about what they had found and what it meant and what they needed. When Stahl came back, Case was ready for him. "The Authority wants the expedition stood down," Stahl said, when they were alone in the platform's small briefing room, pending a full colonial security review. "You'll be transported to Port Keshian. All recordings and data will be secured." "They communicated with me," Case said. A pause. "The geological formation. I touched the wall and they responded. Whatever's down there, whatever built that system, whatever has been using those drones to monitor this lake for 40 years, they initiated contact." He leaned forward. "You understand what that means. You've understood it for at least 18 months, since the first incidents. That's why you've been suppressing the reports." Stahl was very still. "You can't control this," Case said. "You could never control it. All you've been doing is giving them time to study us, which is probably exactly what they wanted." He sat back. "The ones we encountered today are watchers. Scouts, maybe. The communication architecture down there is designed for something much larger. The signal range those patterns encode for goes far beyond this planet. Whatever is down there is connected to something else, something further out. It's been watching humans expand across colonial space for the better part of 2 centuries, and it decided, 3 weeks ago, to let us know it was here. Why now? I don't know. But I know that Marin Voss was the first one who didn't just take the surface evidence and write her report. The first one who went looking. And I think they killed her for it. And I think they're not sure that was the right choice." He thought about the figure in the suit standing beside him at the wall, pointing. "I think that's what they were trying to tell me." Stahl looked at the table for a long time. He had the face of a man whose certainties were losing altitude. "The Authority will not authorize further. The Authority doesn't have jurisdiction over a first contact situation. Colonial Charter is explicit on that." The moment there is confirmed evidence of non-terrestrial intelligence in a colonial zone, governance transfers to the Joint Xenological Council. Case slid a data chip across the table, which is what Marin was trying to trigger when she died. She'd already drafted the transfer request. She just needed one more dive to complete the evidence packet. He looked at Stahl. I finished it. The thing that nobody told you about first contact protocols. The thing that took Case 2 days in Port Kessian to work out. Sitting in a requisition conference room with Kovacs and Fenn, and 3 bewildered authority functionaries who had clearly not expected any of their training to become relevant, was that the protocols were written by people who had assumed first contact would happen on a ship or in open space or somewhere with a clear chain of command and no commercial lease agreements with a terraforming consortium. Nobody had written the protocol for what to do when the non-terrestrial intelligence is currently occupying a geological system that sits directly beneath 300 square kilometers of colonial development zone, and the colonial governor is on a comm every 6 hours reminding you of the contractual implications. Governor Hald was a small woman with the meticulous composure of someone who had spent 20 years preventing disasters and had never lost the reflex. She did not shout. She made clear, in the way that someone makes clear without raising their voice, that the discovery of non-terrestrial intelligence was a significant event, and that the discovery of a non-terrestrial intelligence whose infrastructure occupied terrain already under active development was a significantly more complex event, and that the 40,000 people who lived in the Kessian colonial zone were depending on decisions being made correctly. I understand that, Case said. Do you, Dr. Howell? Because from where I sit, you have entered an uncharted geological system without adequate support, made unilateral contact with. They've been here for at least 400 million years, Case said. We've been here for 60. We are guests in their geological system, Governor, whether or not the colonial lease says otherwise. He watched her absorb that. She was good at absorbing things. She just let them sit in her expression for a moment and then filed them somewhere. What do they want? She said. I don't know yet. But the fact that we went to the trouble of building a decoy and putting it on our shore and waiting to see who came looking, that's not aggression. That's a test. We passed it. He paused. Marin passed it first. They need to know that matters to us. He went back down on day 5. Alone, this time. Kovacs and Fenn had argued against it with the focused persistence of people who have decided, that their professional obligation includes keeping someone they've started to respect alive. And Case had listened to them and appreciated it, and gone anyway. He'd strapped his father's old dive watch to the outside of his suit, where it would be visible, instead of wearing it under the cuff the way he usually did. His father had worn that watch into the Mariana Trench survey in 2087, the last major deep ocean project before the first colony ships launched. It was a habit Case had never been able to explain to anyone's satisfaction, including his own. Torben had extended his rig to 8 hours without being asked. He'd handed it over without ceremony and said, "Third O-ring from the manifold is new. Don't load it hard," and gone back to his work, which was the closest thing to a blessing Case was likely to get. The fracture mouth accepted him the same as before. The cave system was unchanged, the dormant drones in their alcoves, the sentry row in the second chamber, with their sensor arrays rotating to track him as he passed. He moved through without hurrying. He let himself be tracked. He thought, "You've been watching long enough. You know what I am. Let's find out what you are." The third chamber was quiet when he entered. The figure in Marin's suit was not there. The living wall pulsed steadily, its light patterns running in what he was beginning to think of as the idle state. Present, aware, not yet engaged. He positioned himself in front of it. He reached up and touched it with his left hand, his watch side, the way you should something that mattered to you. The patterns responded immediately, cascading outward, running to the edges, turning changed. He watched the sequences, and he thought, in a way that was not quite conscious and not quite instinct, about the mentor who had died to find this place. About the test on the shore, and the 40 years of watching before that, and the 400 million years before that. About what it meant to be a species that outlasted everything, that dug in and waited and studied and decided, finally, that the creatures in the shallow water above were at least interesting enough to risk contact with. He thought about humans specifically, about what was specifically human about the situation he was in, not the technology, not the training. The fact that he was here at all, having been told not to come because a woman he had loved in a complicated way had died finding this room, and he was not willing to let that be the end of the sentence. The wall shifted. New patterns he hadn't seen in the first dive. Faster, more complex, moving in nested recursions that had the quality of deliberate communication rather than a general signal. Case watched them and breathed steadily and tried to be patient. Then the wall went dark. Complete darkness for 3 seconds that felt much longer. His light caught nothing but the faint iridescence of the wall surface, quiet, waiting. And then, in the center of the wall, a single point of light appeared and expanded slowly into a circle. And inside the circle, a pattern assembled itself that Case looked at for a long time before he understood what he was seeing. It was the lake, Loch 9, from above, rendered in light with a precision that indicated very accurate mapping. Updated recently, he could see the platform, the colonial settlement grid at the western end, the survey buoy network, and at the center of the lake, pulsing slowly, point that was not the platform and not any colonial structure. It pulsed, and then a second ring expanded outward from it, slow and deliberate. Case counted the rings as they expanded, and they were not distance indicators. They were time. He sat with that for a moment. "How long?" he said, knowing they couldn't hear language. He reached up and touched the point at the center. The wall responded with a cascade he couldn't read yet. He tried something else. He removed his hand and waited. And when the patterns settled to their idle state, his hand up slowly and touched a spot beside the central point, slightly offset, and held his hand there and waited. The wall went through 3 pattern cycles. Then it produced the same map again, with the central point still present. Beside it, offset at exactly the distance he had placed his hand, a new point appeared. Smaller, younger. It pulsed at a different rate. He understood. There were 2 of them. Whatever was down here, it was not alone in the system. There was the one that had been here for 400 million years. Deep in the fracture zone, slow and ancient and patient. And there was something else. Something newer, something that had arrived more recently, something that was the reason for the drones and the sentries, and the decoy on the shore, and the death of Marin Voss. Something the Elder Presence was as wary of as Case was. He surfaced with 2 hours of air remaining, and said nothing to anyone for 10 minutes. He sat on the dive platform deck with his off, and his hands on his knees, and he looked at the lock. It was as flat and dark and featureless as it had ever been, and he worked it through. Priya found him there. "You have that face," she said. Face. The face that means you've worked something out and you're trying to figure out how to say it. He looked at her. "Team. Marin called me because she needed someone who had worked in adversarial xenobiological environments. Not because she needed a xenobiologist. Because she needed someone who had been in a situation where the thing you're studying is also studying you, and understands the difference. It's the difference. When you study something, you can afford to be patient. When something studies you, the timeline is set by someone else's agenda." He looked back at the lock. The Elder Presence down there didn't kill Marin. It's been here 400 million years and it doesn't kill. It watches, it waits, it tests. The decoy was the Elder's test. He paused. "The drones in the Sentry Row are not the same construction as the one I found in the alcove on the first dive. Different fabrication signature. The sentries are newer, and they killed Marin." Priya was quiet. "The newer entity has been in the fracture zone for somewhere between 40 and 60 years, approximately coinciding with the first human colonial expansion in this sector. It found the Elder's system and moved into it. And the Elder, which has been here longer than complex life on Earth, let it in. Which means it either couldn't stop it, was running another test." "Testing what?" "Whether we'd figure it out." He looked at her, and what we'd do when we did. He told Stahl that night that he needed CR9. Stahl looked at him. "It's a shaped explosive compound used in geological operations," Case said. "The Authority survey team has 4 charges rated for deep rock application. I need them." You're going to blow up a 400 million-year-old alien structure. I'm going to collapse a 40-meter section of a lateral passage, the eastern wing of the fracture system. The eastern wing is where the newer entity's construction is concentrated. The Elder's core chamber is in the west. The collapse isolates the newer entity's infrastructure from the Elder's signal network, is what the newer entity has been parasitizing for the past 40 to 60 years. He looked at Stahl. Think of it as eviction. And if the newer entity retaliates, it won't be able to. Not without the signal network. Its drones are networked through the Elder's bioluminescent architecture. Without that, they're blind. That's why the sentries killed Marin. They're the only fully autonomous units in the system. Without the network, they're the only weapons it has left, and they're already logged and located, and Kovacs and Fenn can deal with them on the way in. Stahl looked at him for a long time with the expression of a man who had spent his career maintaining the authorities' position, and was now watching the authorities' position become irrelevant. You talked to it, Stahl said, in a limited way, and it told you all of this. It showed me the map. I worked out the rest. Case thought about the wall, the 2 points of light pulsing at different rates. But yes, it asked for help the only way it could. Stahl was quiet. Then, if this goes wrong, a lot of things can go wrong. That's true in every situation. It's just usually more obvious. They went in at Euro 600 Case, Kovacs Fenn, carrying 4 CR9 charges and the knowledge of the Eastern Wing's layout from Case's 2 previous dives. Torben had rigged a remote detonation relay to the surface, so the charges could be set without divers in the water at the moment of fire. The relay had a 3-kilometer operational range, and Torben had personally tested it 4 times, and then tested it again and said O-rings are good, in a tone that admitted no alternative. The cave system was different. Not physically different. The chambers were where they had been. The wall patterns in the 3rd chamber were running in their idle state when Case passed through. But the sentry row in the 2nd chamber was empty. All 12 alcoves vacant, the drones gone, deployed somewhere in the system. They know we're here, Fenn said. They've always known we're here, Case said. Today they've decided to do something about it. The first drone found them in the passage between the 2nd and 3rd chambers. It came from above, had been wedged into a ceiling crack, waiting, and dropped into the water between Kovacs and Case with the sudden hydraulic violence of something that had been designed for exactly this. Case had a half-second of it, filling his field of vision before Kovacs took it apart, with a shaped tool stroke that left it in 2 pieces spinning slowly in the water. Kovacs was already moving before Case had processed what had happened. That's one, Fenn said. There were 3 more in the eastern passage. Fenn took the first, which came at her from the left wall, with a speed that was not crustacean in any natural sense. Kovacs and Case split the other 2 between them in the space of a lateral crack that required them to move in single file. Should have been a killing ground, and wasn't because Kovacs had already assessed it on the approach and positioned Case behind him and taken the angle away from the enemy before the enemy knew. The angle was what it was betting on. Ex-colonial marine, Case thought, with every difficult silence. The eastern wing opened up beyond the crack into a chamber that was the mirror of the Elder's 3rd chamber. Same scale, same ceiling height, same floor surface. But where the Elder's wall was alive with light, this wall was dark and featureless, and the floor was covered in drone housings, most of them empty, few still occupied by units that had not yet deployed. Case set the first charge against the eastern passage wall at the structural point his mapping indicated was the load-bearing junction of the lateral system. While he worked, the last drones deployed. It was not a dramatic engagement. It was the engagement of people who have gone somewhere with a specific task and intend to complete it, encountering resistance that is real and dangerous and not sufficient. Kovacs and Fenn moved through the chamber with the unhurried economy of people who have trained the hesitation out of themselves, and the drones were fast and well-designed, but they were autonomous units with programmed response patterns, and they were operating against 2 people who understood that the patterns were patterns and had been studying them for the past 6 days. The last drone ended up on the floor in pieces, one of its sensor arrays still rotating slowly, tracking Kovacs by habit even in malfunction. Case set the fourth charge and armed the relay. "Clear," he said. They cleared. The detonation, 3 kilometers above and 30 seconds later, felt like the lock itself exhaling. The platform shuddered under their feet. The water column on the eastern side of the survey grid churned for 90 seconds, and then settled. The acoustic sensors registered a collapse event consistent with approximately 40 meters of lateral passage, was what Case had calculated, and which Torben confirmed with the equanimity of a man who trusted his O-rings. Case stood on the deck and watched the water settle. Stahl came to stand beside him. For once he didn't have his tablet. "How will you know it worked?" he said. "We'll go back down tomorrow and see if the Elder's Wall is still running." He looked at the lock. "If the signal's clean and the parasitic load is gone, we'll know." And then? Case thought about the wall. About the point of light in the center of the map, pulsing slowly. About 400 million years of patience, and the decision that was made to let 2 bipedal newcomers know they were not alone in the dark. "Then we start trying to learn to talk," he said. Stahl was quiet for a moment. "The authority will want a formal process, a committee." "Security, I know." Case looked at him. The first word was already said. And it was said by someone the authority didn't send. And it was heard by something the authority didn't know was listening. "You can put a committee around it, if that helps you sleep. The conversation is already underway." He thought about Marin. About the careful flat voice on the comm 3 weeks ago. "I found something." He thought about the red tape around the ankle of the boot. He thought about what it meant to go toward the thing that was not yet understood rather than away from it. About the specific quality of human stubbornness that looked like recklessness from the outside but from the inside felt like the most natural thing in the world. Some things were human in ways that were hard to name. The drive toward the unknown was one of them. Bravery. Bravery was a decision made against fear. This was something older than the decision. The refusal at the cellular level to look at a closed door and accept that it should stay closed. He went inside. The wall was clean in the morning. Case came up from the 3rd chamber with his recordings and his pulse at something approaching normal and found Kovacs and Fenn already in the equipment bay cleaning their gear with the methodical care of people who intended to come back. Priya was at the sonar station, running part of acoustic maps between yesterday and today. And she looked up when he came in with an expression that confirmed what his instruments had already told him. The parasitic load was gone. The Elder's signal was running full and unimpeded for the first time in, well, Case didn't know how long. He suspected no living human did. The committee arrived from Port Keshen 4 days later. 3 xenologists, 2 diplomatic linguists, a colonial security officer, a representative from the Joint Xenological Council, who had been asleep when the transfer arrived and had the mild, shell-shocked look of someone whose theoretical specialty has abruptly become operational. Quite. They arrived with equipment and protocols, and the careful professional excitement of people entering a situation that their field had spent decades preparing for and privately doubting would ever occur. Case spent 2 days briefing them. He walked them through everything. The decoy, cave system, the drones, the Elder's Wall, the map, the 2 points of light. He was thorough and precise, and he answered every question twice when asked. On the evening of the 2nd day, the lead xenologist, a small, quiet woman named Dr. O'Cake, who reminded him of Marin in the way that competent people in the same field sometimes reminded you of each other, came, found him on the deck. "I want to ask you something," she said. "When you first made contact, when you touched the wall, what were you thinking?" "About?" He considered the question. Outside, the lock was flat and dark and the moons were up. "A boot," he said. "She waited. My mentor. She died finding that room. I was thinking about the fact that she'd gone there alone in the dark, because she needed to know what was there. And that it felt like the most human thing I'd ever seen anyone do, and I wanted whatever was in that room to know that it mattered, that she mattered." He looked at the water. "I don't know if they could tell any of that from me touching a wall." "What did it feel like?" He thought about it. "Like being seen," he said. Dr. O'Cake nodded slowly, the way someone nodded when a thing confirmed something they'd been thinking. "That's in your report, actually. In different words. That's the thing they'll study most, you know. Not the wall patterns, not the drone technology. The fact that a human being went 400 meters down into an alien structure alone because a colleague died, and the first thing they communicated was that the colleague mattered. Case looked at her. It's not tactical, she said. It's not strategic. It's not survival behavior. From an observation standpoint, if you've been watching us for 40 years, you have the other data. You have our ships, our technology, our expansion patterns, our military infrastructure. None of that is surprising to a 400-million-year-old intelligence. You've seen civilization sims come and go. She looked at the water. But you haven't seen one that goes back for its dead. Case was quiet for a moment. She wasn't dead yet when I came, he said. I didn't know she was dead. No, Dr. O'Cake said. That's the point. The lock gave nothing back from its surface, the way it never did. Broad and dark and deep beyond measuring, hold everything it held without apology. Patient in the manner of very old things that have learned that patience is not passivity, that waiting for the right moment is not the same as doing nothing. Somewhere below, in the deep western chambers of the fracture system, a light pulsed in the way. A light pulsed when it was making a sound that the medium wouldn't carry. When it was saying something to an empty room and trusting that the room would eventually stop being empty. It had waited 400 million years. It could wait a little longer. But the door was open, and on the shore above, the light in the equipment bay stayed on late, and voices carried across the water, arguing, explaining, asking questions that nobody could answer yet. And somewhere in the acoustic record of the lock, in the frequencies that human instruments were only just learning to read, something ancient noted the sound of it with the careful attention of a being that has encountered, finally, something it did not expect. Species that went looking. A species that went back. A species that had not yet learned, despite every available reason, to be afraid of the dark.